Welcome back to Paper Cuts, everyone. Last we left off, we had a little bit of an adventure with my energy level, but now we can get back into the book proper with chapter 17, showing what happened on the voyage from Singapore to Hong Kong. The detective and Passepartout met often on deck after this interview, though Fix was reserved and didn't attempt to induce his companion to divulge any more facts concerning Mr. Fogg. He caught a glimpse of that mysterious gentleman once or twice, but Mr. Fogg usually confined himself to the cabin, where he kept out of company, or, according to his inveterate habit, took a hand at whist. Passepartout began very seriously to conjecture what strange chance kept Fix still on the route that his master was pursuing. It was really worth considering why this certainly very amiable and complacent person, whom he'd first met at Suez, had then encountered on board the Mongolia, who disembarked at Bombay, which he announced as his destination, and now turned up so unexpectedly on the Rangoon, was following Mr. Fogg's tracks step by step. What was Fix's object? Passepartout was ready to wager his Indian shoes, which he religiously preserved, that Fix would also leave Hong Kong at the same time with them, and probably on the same steamer. Passepartout might have cudgelled his brain for a century without hitting upon the real object in which the detective had in view. He never could have imagined that Phileas Fogg was being tracked as a robber around the globe. But as it is in human nature to attempt the solution of every mystery, Passepartout suddenly discovered an explanation of Fix's movements, which was in truth far from unreasonable. Fix, he thought, could only be an agent of Mr. Fogg's friends at the Reform Club, sent to follow him up and to ascertain that he really went round the world as had been agreed upon. "It's clear," replied the worthy servant to himself, proud of his shrewdness. "He's a spy sent to keep us in view. That isn't quite the thing, either, to be spying Mr. Fogg, who is so honourable a man. Ah, gentlemen of the Reform, this shall cost you dearly." Passepartout, enchanted with his discovery, resolved to say nothing to his master, lest he should be justly offended at this mistrust on the part of his adversaries. But he determined to chaff Fix, when he had the chance, with mysterious allusions, which, however, need not betray his real suspicions. During the afternoon of Wednesday, 30th October, the Rangoon entered the Strait of Malacca, which separates the peninsula of that name from Sumatra. The mountainous and craggy inlets intercepted the beauties of this noble island from the view of the travellers. The Rangoon weighed anchor at Singapore the next day at 4 a.m. to receive coal, having gained half a day on the prescribed time of her arrival. Phileas Fogg noted this gain in his journal, and then, accompanied by Aouda, who betrayed a desire for a walk on shore, disembarked. Fix, who suspected Mr. Fogg's every movement, followed them cautiously, without himself being perceived, while Passepartout, laughing in his sleeve at Fix's manoeuvres, went about his usual errands. The island of Singapore is not imposing in aspect, for there are no mountains, yet its appearance is not without attraction. It's a park checkered by pleasant highways and avenues. A handsome carriage, drawn by a sleek pair of New Holland horses, carried Phileas Fogg and Aouda into the midst of rows of palms with brilliant foliage, and of clove trees, whereof the cloves form the heart of a half-open flower. Pepper plants replaced the prickly hedges of European fields. Sago bushes, large ferns with gorgeous branches, varied the aspect of this tropical clime, while nutmeg trees in full foliage filled the air with a penetrating perfume. Agile and grinning bands of monkeys skipped about in the trees, and nor were tigers wanting in the jungles. After a drive of 2 hours through the country, Aouda and Mr. Fogg returned to the town, which is a vast collection of heavy-looking, irregular houses, surrounded by charming gardens, rich in tropical fruits and plants. And at 10 o'clock they re-embarked, closely followed by the detective, who had kept them constantly in sight. Passepartout, who had been purchasing several dozen mangoes, a fruit as large as a good-sized apple, of a dark brown color outside and bright red within, and whose white pulp, melting in the mouth, affords gourmands a delicious sensation, was waiting for them on deck. He was only too glad to offer some mangoes to Aouda, who thanked him gracefully for them. At 11 o'clock, the Rangoon rode out of Singapore harbor, and in a few hours the high mountains of Malacca, with their forests inhabited by the most beautifully furred tigers in the world, were lost to view. Singapore is distant some 1,300 miles from the island of Hong Kong, which is a little English colony near the Chinese coast. Phileas Fogg hoped to accomplish the journey in 6 days, so as to be in time for the steamer which would leave on the 6th of November for Yokohama, the principal Japanese port. The Rangoon had a large quota of passengers, many of whom disembarked at Singapore, among them a number of Indians, Ceylonese, Chinamen, Malays, and Portuguese, mostly second-class travelers. The weather, which had hitherto been fine, changed with the last quarter of the moon. The sea rolled heavily, and the wind at intervals rose almost to a storm, but happily blew from the southwest, and thus aided the steamer's progress. The captain, as often as possible, put up his sails, and under the double action of steam and sail, the vessel made rapid progress along the coasts of Annam and Cochin China. Owing to the defective construction of the Rangoon, however, unusual precautions became necessary in unfavorable weather, but the loss of time which resulted from this, while it drove Passepartout out of his senses, didn't seem to affect his master in the least. Passepartout blamed the captain, the engineer, and the crew, and consigned all who were connected with the ship to the land where the pepper grows. Perhaps the thought of the gas, which was remorselessly burning at his expense in Savile Row, had something to do with his hot impatience. "You're in a great hurry, then, to reach Hong Kong?" said Fix to him one day. "A very great hurry." "Mr. Fogg, I suppose, is anxious to catch the steamer for Yokohama?" "Terribly anxious." "You believe in this journey around the world, then?" "Absolutely. Don't you, Mr. Fix?" "I don't believe a word of it." "You're a sly dog," said Passepartout, winking at him. His expression rather disturbed Fix without his knowing why. Had the Frenchman guessed his real purpose? He knew not what to think. But how could Passepartout have discovered that he was a detective? Yet in speaking as he did, the man evidently meant more than he expressed. Passepartout went still further the next day. He couldn't hold his tongue. "Mr. Fix, shall we be so unfortunate as to lose you when we get to Hong Kong?" "Oh, well, I don't know. Perhaps." "Oh, if only you could go on with us. An agent of the Peninsular Company, you know, can't stop on the way. You were only going to Bombay, and here you are in China. America is not far off, and from America to Europe is only a step." Fix looked intently at his companion, whose countenance was serene as possible, and laughed with him. But Passepartout persisted in chaffing him by asking him if he made much by his present occupation. "Well, yes and no. There's good and bad luck in such things. But you must understand I don't travel at my own expense." "Oh, I'm quite sure of that," cried Passepartout, laughing heartily. Fix, fairly puzzled, descended to his cabin and gave himself up to his reflections. He was evidently suspected. Somehow or other, the Frenchman had found out he was a detective. But had he told his master? What part was he playing in all this? Was he an accomplice or not? Was the game, then, up? Fix spent several hours turning these things over in his mind, sometimes thinking that all was lost, and then persuading himself that Fogg was ignorant of his presence, and then undecided what course it was best to take. Nevertheless, he preserved his coolness of mind, and at last resolved to deal plainly with Passepartout. If he didn't find it practical to arrest Fogg at Hong Kong, and if Fogg made preparations to leave that last foothold of English territory, he, Fix, would tell Passepartout all. Either the servant was the accomplice of his master, or in this case the master knew of his operations and he should fail. Or else the servant knew nothing about the robbery, and then his interest would be to abandon the robber. Such was the situation between Fix and Passepartout. Meanwhile, Phileas Fogg moved about above them in the most majestic and unconscious indifference. He was passing methodically in his orbit around the world, regardless of the lesser stars which gravitated around him. And yet there was nearby what the astronomers would call a disturbing star, which might have produced an agitation in this gentleman's heart, But no, the charms of Aouda failed to act, to Passepartout's great surprise, and the disturbances, if they existed, would have been more difficult to calculate than those of Uranus, which led to the discovery of Neptune. It was every day an increasing wonder to Passepartout, who read in Aouda's eyes the depth of her gratitude to his master. Phileas Fogg, though brave and gallant, must be, he thought, quite heartless. As to the sentiment which this journey might have awakened in him, there was clearly no trace of such a thing, while poor Passepartout existed in perpetual reveries. One day he was leaning on the railing of the engine-room, and was observing the engine, when a sudden pitch of the steamer threw the screw out of the water. The steam came hissing out of the valves, and this made Passepartout indignant. "The valves are not sufficiently charged. We are not going. Oh, this is English. If this was an American craft we should blow up, perhaps, but we should at all events go faster." Chapter 10, 5, 3, 18. Chapter 18, in which Phileas Fogg, Passepartout, and Fix go each about his business. The weather was bad during the latter days of the voyage. The wind, obstinately remaining in the northwest, blew a gale and slowed the steamer. The Rangoon rolled heavily, and the passengers became impatient of the long, monstrous waves which the wind raised before their path. A sort of tempest arose on the 3rd of November, the squall knocking the vessel about with fury, and the waves running high. The Rangoon reefed all her sails, and even the rigging proved too much, whistling and shaking amid the squall. The steamer was forced to proceed slowly, and the captain estimated that she would reach Hong Kong 20 hours behind time, and more if the storm lasted. Phileas Fogg gazed at the tempestuous sea, which seemed to be struggling especially to delay him with his habitual tranquillity. He never changed countenance for an instant, though a delay of 20 hours, by making him too late for the Yokohama boat, would almost inevitably cause the loss of the wager. But this man of nerve manifested neither impatience nor annoyance. It seemed as if the storm were a part of his programme and had been foreseen. Aouda was amazed to find him as calm as he had been from the first time she had seen him. Fix didn't look at the state of things in the same light. The storm greatly pleased him, in fact. His satisfaction would have been complete had the Rangoon been forced to retreat before the violence of wind and waves. Each delay filled him with hope, for it became more and more probable that Fogg would be obliged to remain some days in Hong Kong, and now the heavens themselves became his allies, with the gusts and squalls. It mattered not that they made him seasick, he made no account of this inconvenience, and while his body was writhing under their effects, his spirit bounded with hopeful exultation. Passepartout was enraged beyond expression by the unpropitious weather. Everything had gone so well until now. Earth and sea had seemed to be in his master's service. Steamers and railways obeyed him. Wind and steam united to speed his journey. Had the hour of adversity come? Passepartout was as much excited as if the £20,000 were to come from his own pocket. The storm exasperated him, the gale made him furious, and he longed to lash the obstinate sea into obedience. Poor fellow! Fix carefully concealed from his own satisfaction, for had he betrayed it, Passepartout would scarcely have restrained himself from personal violence. Passepartout remained on deck as long as the tempest lasted, being unable to remain quiet below, and taking it into his head to aid the progress of the ship by lending a hand with the crew. He overwhelmed the captain, officers, and sailors, who couldn't help laughing at his impatience, with all sorts of questions. He wanted to know exactly how long the storm was going to last, whereupon he referred to the barometer, which seemed to have no intention of rising. Passepartout shook it, but with no perceptible effect, for neither shaking nor maledictions could prevail upon it to change its mind. On the 4th, however, the sea became more calm, and the storm lessened its violence. The wind veered southward, and was once more favourable. Passepartout cleared up with the weather, and some of the sails were unfurled, and the Rangoon resumed its rapid speed. The time lost, however, could not be regained. Land was not signalled until 5 o'clock on the morning of the 6th, and the steamer was due on the 5th. Phileas Fogg was 24 hours behindhand, and the Yokohama steamer would, of course, be missed. The pilot went on board at 6 and took his place on the bridge to guide the Rangoon through the channels to the port of Hong Kong. Passepartout longed to ask him if the steamer had left for Yokohama, but he dared not, for he wished to preserve the spark of hope which still remained till the last moment. He had confided his anxiety to Fix, who, the sly rascal, tried to console him by saying that Mr. Fogg would be in time if he took the next boat, but this only put Passepartout in a passion. Mr. Fogg, bolder than his servant, didn't hesitate to approach the pilot and tranquilly ask him if he knew when a steamer would leave Hong Kong for Yokohama. "At high tide tomorrow morning." "Ah," said Mr. Fogg, without betraying any astonishment. And Passepartout, who had heard what had passed, would willingly have embraced the pilot, while Fix would have been glad to twist his neck. "What is the steamer's name?" "The Carnatic." Ought she not to have gone yesterday?" "Yes, sir, but they had to repair one of her boilers, so her departure was postponed till tomorrow." "Thank you," returned Mr. Fogg, descending mathematically to the saloon. Passepartout clasped the pilot's hand and shook it heartily in delight, exclaiming, "Pilot, you are the best of good fellows." The pilot probably doesn't know to this day why his responses won him this enthusiastic greeting. He remounted the bridge and guided the steamer through the flotilla of junks, tonkas, and fishing boats which crowd the harbor of Hong Kong. At 1 o'clock the Rangoon was at the quay, and the passengers were going ashore. Chance had strangely favored Phileas Fogg, for had not the Carnatic been forced to lie over for boiler repairs, she would have left on the 6th of November, and the passengers for Japan would have been obliged to wait a week for the sailing of the next steamer. Mr. Fogg, it is true, 24 hours behind his time, but this couldn't seriously imperil the remainder of his tour. The steamer which crossed the Pacific from Yokohama to San Francisco made a direct connection with that from Hong Kong, and it couldn't sail until the latter reached Yokohama. And if Mr. Fogg was 24 hours late on reaching Yokohama, this time would no doubt be easily regained in the voyage of the 22 days across the Pacific. He found himself then about 24 hours behindhand, 35 days after leaving London. The Carnatic was announced to leave Hong Kong at 5 the next morning. Mr. Fogg had 16 hours in which to attend to his business there, which was to deposit Aouda safely with her wealthy relative. On landing, he conducted her to a palanquin, in which they repaired to the club hotel. A room was engaged for the young woman, and Mr. Fogg, after seeing that she wanted for nothing, set out in search of her cousin Jejeh. He instructed Passepartout to remain at the hotel until his return, that Aouda might not be left entirely alone. Mr. Fogg repaired to the Exchange, where, he didn't doubt, everyone would know so wealthy and considerable a personage as the Parsee merchant. Meeting a broker, he made the inquiry to learn that Jejeh had left China 2 years before, and retiring from his business with an immense fortune, had taken up his residence in Europe, in Holland, the broker thought, with the merchants of which country he had principally traded. Fogg returned to the hotel, begged a moment's conversation with Aouda, and without more ado apprised her that Jejeh was no longer at Hong Kong, but probably in Holland. At first Aouda said nothing. She passed her hand across her forehead, and then reflected a few moments. Then in her sweet, soft voice she said, What ought I to do, Mr. Fogg?" "It's very simple. Go on to Europe." "But I cannot intrude." "You do not intrude, nor do you in the least embarrass my project. Passepartout." "Monsieur?" "Go to the Carnatic and engage 3 cabins." Passepartout, delighted that the young woman, who was very gracious to him, was going to continue the journey with them, went off at a brisk gait to obey his master's order. Chapter 19, in which Passepartout takes too great an interest in his master, and what comes of it. Hong Kong is an island, which came to the possession of the English by the Treaty of Nankin, after the War of 1842, and the colonizing genius of the English has created upon it an important city and excellent port. The island is situated at the mouth of the Canton River, and is separated by about 60 miles from the Portuguese town of Macau on the opposite coast. Hong Kong has beaten Macau in the struggle for the Chinese trade, and now the greater part of the transportation of Chinese goods find its depot at the former place. Docks, hospitals, wharves, a Gothic cathedral, a government house, macadamized streets give to Hong Kong the appearance of a town in Kent or Surrey, transferred by some strange magic to the antipodes. Passepartout wandered, with his hands in his pockets, toward the Victoria port, gazing as he went at the curious palanquins and other modes of conveyance, and the groups of Chinese, Japanese, and Europeans who passed to and fro in the streets. Hong Kong seemed to him not unlike Bombay, Calcutta, and Singapore, since, like them, it betrayed everywhere the evidence of English supremacy. At the Victoria port he found a confused mass of ships of all nations, English, French, American, and Dutch, men of war and trading vessels, Japanese and Chinese junks, sempas, tonkas, and flower boats, which formed so many floating parterres. Passepartout noticed in the crowd a number of the natives who seemed very old and dressed in yellow. On going into a barber's to get shaved, he learned that these ancient men were all at least 80 years old, at which age they are permitted to wear yellow, which is the imperial color. Passepartout, without exactly knowing why, thought this very strange. And on reaching the quay where they were to embark on the Carnatic, he was not astonished to find Fix walking up and down. The detective seemed very much disturbed and disappointed. "Oh, this is bad for the gentlemen of the Reform Club." He accosted Fix with a merry smile, as if he had not perceived that gentleman's chagrin. The detective had, indeed, good reasons to inveigh against the bad luck which pursued him. The warrant had not come. It was certainly on the way, but as certainly it could not now reach Hong Kong for several days, and this being the last English territory on Mr. Fogg's route, the robber would escape, unless he could manage to detain him. "Well, Monsieur Fix, have you decided to go with us so far as America?" said Passepartout. "Yes," said Fix, through his set teeth. "Oh, good! I knew you could not persuade yourself to separate from us. Come and engage your berth," exclaimed Passepartout, laughing heartily. They entered the steamer office and secured cabins for 4 persons, and the clerk, as he gave them the tickets, informed them that the repairs in the Carnatic having been completed, the steamer would leave that very evening, and not next morning, as has been announced. "That will suit my master all the better," said Passepartout. "I will go and let him know." Fix now decided to make a bold move. He resolved to tell Passepartout all. It seemed to be the only possible means of keeping Phileas Fogg several days longer at Hong Kong, and he accordingly invited his companion into a tavern which caught his eye on the quay. On entering, they found themselves in a large room handsomely decorated, at the end of which was a large camp bed furnished with cushions. Several persons lay upon this bed in a deep sleep, and at the small tables which were arranged about the room, some 30 customers were drinking English beer, porter, gin, and brandy, smoking, the while, long red clay pipes stuffed with little balls of opium, mingled with essence of rose. From time to time, one of the smokers, overcome with a narcotic, would slip under the table, whereupon the waiters, taking him by the head and feet, carried him and laid him upon the bed. The bed already supported 20 of these stupefied sots. Fix and Passepartout saw that they were in a smoking-house, haunted by those wretched, cadaverous, idiotic creatures to whom the English merchants sell every year the miserable drug called opium, to the amount of £1,400,000, thousands devoted to one of the most despicable vices which afflict humanity. The Chinese government has in vain attempted to deal with the evil by stringent laws. It passed gradually from the rich, to whom it was at first exclusively reserved, to the lower classes, and then its ravages could not be arrested. Opium smoked everywhere, at all times, by men and women in the Celestial Empire, and once accustomed to it, the victims cannot dispense with it, except by suffering horrible bodily contortions and agonies. A great smoker can smoke as many as 8 pipes a day, but he dies in 5 years. It was in one of these dens that Fix and Passepartout, in search of a friendly glass, found themselves. Passepartout had no money, but he willingly accepted Fix's invitation, in the hope of returning the obligation at some future time. They ordered 2 bottles of port, to which the Frenchman did ample justice, while Fix observed him with close attention. They chatted about the journey, and Passepartout was especially merry at the idea that Fix was going to continue it with them. When the bottles were empty, however, he rose to go and tell his master the change of time of the sailing of the Carnatic. Fix caught him by the arm and said, "Wait a moment." "What for, Mr. Fix?" "I want to have a serious talk with you." "A serious talk?" cried Passepartout, drinking up the little wine that was left in the bottom of his glass. "Well, we'll talk about it tomorrow. I haven't time now." Oh, come on, stay. What I have to say concerns your master, after all." Passepartout, at this, looked attentively at his companion. Fix's face seemed to have a singular expression, and he resumed his seat. "What is it that you have to say?" Fix placed his hand upon Passepartout's arm, and, lowering his voice, said, "You've guessed who I am?" "Parbleu." "Then I'm going to tell you everything." "Now that I know everything, my friend. That's very good. But go on. First, though, let me tell you those gentlemen have put themselves to a useless expense." "Useless? You speak confidently. It's clear you don't know how large the sum is." "Of course I do. 20,000 pounds." 55,000, answered Fix, pressing his companion's hand. "What? As Monsieur Fogg did? 55,000 pounds. There's all the more reason for not losing an instant," he continued, getting up hastily. Fix pushed Passepartout back in his chair, and resumed. 55,000 pounds, and if I succeed, I get 2,000 pounds. If you help me, I'll let you have 500 of them. "Help you?" cried Passepartout, whose eyes were standing wide open. "Yeah, help me keep Fogg here for 2 or 3 days." "Why, what are you saying? Those gentlemen are not satisfied with following my master, suspecting his honor, but they must try to put obstacles in his way. I blush for them." "What do you mean?" "I mean that it's a piece of shameful trickery. They may as well waylay Mr. Fogg and put money in their pockets." "That's just what we count on doing." "It's a conspiracy, then," cried Passepartout, who became more and more excited as the liquor mounted in his head, for he drank without perceiving it. "A real conspiracy, and gentlemen too. Blah." Fix began to be puzzled. "Members of the Reform Club. You must know, Monsieur Fix, that my master is an honest man, and that when he makes a wager he tries to win it fairly." "But who do you think I am?" "Parbleu! An agent of the members of the Reform Club, sent out here to interrupt my master's journey. But though I found you out some time ago, I've taken good care to say nothing about it to Mr. Fogg." "He knows nothing, then?" "Nothing," replied Passepartout, again emptying his glass. The detective passed his hand across his forehead, hesitating before he spoke again. What should he do? Passepartout's mistake seemed sincere, but it made his design more difficult. It was evident that the servant was not the master's accomplice, as Fix had been inclined to suspect. "Well, as he's not an accomplice, he'll help me," said the detective to himself. He had no time to lose. Fogg must be detained at Hong Kong, so he resolved to make a clean breast of it. "Listen to me. I'm not, as you think, an agent of the members of the Reform Club." "Bah!" retorted Passepartout with an air of raillery. "I'm a police detective sent out here by the London office." "You a detective?" "I'll prove it. Here's my commission." Passepartout was speechless with astonishment when Fix displayed this document, the genuineness of which could not be doubted. "Mr. Fogg's wager is only a pretext of which you and the gentlemen of the Reform are dupes. You had a motive for securing your innocent complicity." "But why?" "Listen. On the 28th of last September, a robbery of 55,000 pounds was committed at the Bank of England by a person whose description was fortunately secured. Here is the description. It answers exactly to that of Mr. Phileas Fogg." "Oh, what nonsense!" cried Passepartout, striking the table with his fist. "My master is the most honourable of men." "How can you tell? You scarcely know anything about him. You went into his service the day he came away, and he came away on a foolish pretext, without trunks, and carrying a large amount in bank notes. And you're bold enough to assert he's an honest man. Yes, yes.
Would you like to be arrested as his accomplice?
Passepartout, overcome by what he had heard, held his head between his hands and didn't dare to look at the detective. Phileas Fogg, the savior of Aouda, that brave and generous man. A robber? And yet how many presumptions there were against him! Passepartout essayed to reject the suspicions that had forced themselves upon his mind. He didn't wish to believe that his master was guilty. "Well, what do you want of me?" said he at last with effort.
See here, I've tracked Mr. Fogg to this place, but as yet I have failed to receive the warrant of arrest, for which I sent to London. You must help me to keep him here in Hong Kong.
But I...
I'll share with you the £2,000 reward offered by the Bank of England.
Never, replied Passepartout, who tried to rise, but fell back, exhausted in mind and body. Monsieur Fix, even should what you say be true, if my master is really the robber you're seeking for, which I deny, am in his service. I've seen his generosity and goodness, and I will never betray him. Not for all the gold in the world. I come from a village where they don't eat that kind of bread.
You refuse?
I refuse.
Consider that I've said nothing and let us drink.
Yes, let us drink. Passepartout felt himself yielding more and more to the effects of the liquor. Fix, seeing that he must, at all hazards, be separated from his master, wished to entirely overcome him. Some pipes full of opium lay upon the table, and Fix slipped one into Passepartout's hand. He took it, put it between his lips, lit it, and drew several puffs, and his head, becoming heavy under the influence of the narcotic, fell upon the table.
"At last,"
said Fix, seeing Passepartout unconscious,
"Mr. Fogg won't be informed of the Carnatic's departure, and if he is, he'll have to go without this cursed Frenchman."
And paying his bill, Fix left the tavern. Chapter 20, in which Fix comes face to face with Phileas Fogg. While these events were passing at the opium house, Mr. Fogg, unconscious of the danger he was in of losing the steamer, was quietly escorting Aouda about the streets of the English quarter, making the necessary purchases for the long voyage before them. It was all very well for an Englishman like Mr. Fogg to make a tour of the world with a carpet-bag. A lady couldn't be expected to travel comfortably under such conditions. He acquitted his task with characteristic serenity, and invariably replied to the remonstrances of his fair companion, who was confused by his patience and generosity. "It is in the interest of my journey, a part of my programme." The purchases made, they returned to the hotel, where they dined at a sumptuously served table d'hôte. After which Aouda, shaking hands with her protector after the English fashion, retired to her room for rest. Mr. Fogg absorbed himself throughout the evening in the perusal of the Times and Illustrated London News. Had he been capable of being astonished at anything, it would have been not to see his servant return at bedtime. But knowing the steamer was not to leave for Yokohama until the next morning, he didn't disturb himself about the matter. When Passepartout did not appear the next morning to answer his master's bell, Mr. Fogg, not betraying the least vexation, contented himself with taking his carpet-bag, calling Aouda, and sending for a palanquin. It was then 8 o'clock, at 9:30, it then being high tide, the Carnatic would leave the harbour. Mr. Fogg and Aouda got into the palanquin, their luggage being brought after on a wheelbarrow, and half an hour later stepped upon the quay whence they were to embark. Mr. Fogg then learned the Carnatic had sailed the evening before. He expected to find not only the steamer but his domestic, and was forced to give up both. But no sign of disappointment appeared on his face. He merely remarked to Aouda, "It's an accident, madame, nothing more." At this moment a man who had been observing him attentively approached. It was Fix, who, bowing, addressed Mr. Fogg.
"Were you not, like me, sir, a passenger by the Rangoon which arrived yesterday?"
"I was, sir, but I have not the honour."
"Pardon me, I thought I should find your servant here."
"Do you know where he is, sir?"
"What? Is he not with you?"
said Fix, feigning surprise. "No. He's not made his appearance since yesterday. Could he have gone on board the Carnatic without us?"
"Without you, madame? Excuse me, did you intend to sail on the Carnatic?"
"Yes, sir.
So did I, madame. I'm excessively disappointed. The Carnatic, its repairs being completed, left Hong Kong 12 hours before the stated time. And without any notice either. Now we have to wait a week for another steamer.
As he said a week, Fix felt his heart leap for joy. Fogg detained at Hong Kong for a week. There'd be time for that warrant to arrive, and fortune at last favored the representative of the law. His horror may be imagined when he heard Mr. Fogg say in his placid voice, "But there are other vessels beside the Carnatic, it seems to me, in the harbor of Hong Kong." And offering his arm to Auda, he directed his steps toward the docks, in search of some craft about to start. Fix, stupefied, followed. It seemed as if he were attached to Mr. Fogg by an invisible thread. Chance, however, appeared really to have abandoned the man it had hitherto served so well. For 3 hours Phileas Fogg wandered about the docks, with the determination, if necessary, to charter a vessel, to carry him to Yokohama. But he could only find vessels which were loading or unloading, and which therefore could not set sail. Fix began to hope again, but Fogg, far from being discouraged, was continuing his search, resolved not to stop if he had to resort to Macao, when he was accosted by a sailor on one of the wharves.
"Is your honor looking for a boat?"
"Have you a boat ready to sail?"
"Yes, your honor. A pilot boat, number 43, the best in the harbor."
"Does she go fast?"
"Between 8 and 9 knots the hour. Are you looking at?
"Yes."
Your honor would be satisfied with her for a sea excursion?"
"No, for a voyage."
"A voyage?"
"Yes. Will you agree to take me to Yokohama?" The sailor leaned on the railing, opened his eyes wide, and said,
"Is your honor joking?"
"No. I've missed the Carnatic, and I must get to Yokohama by the 14th at the latest, to take the boat for San Francisco."
"I'm sorry, that's impossible."
"I'll offer you £100 per day, and an additional reward of £200 if I reach Yokohama in time."
"You in earnest?"
"Very much so." The pilot walked away a little distance and gazed out to sea, evidently struggling between the anxiety to gain a large sum and the fear of venturing so far. Fix was in mortal suspense. Fogg turned to Aoda and asked her, "You would not be afraid, would you, madam?"
"Not with you, Mr. Fogg."
And at this the pilot returned, shuffling his hat in his hands. "Well, pilot?"
"Well, your honor, I couldn't risk myself, my men, or my little boat of scarcely 20 tons on so long a voyage at this time of year. Besides, we couldn't reach Yokohama in time. It's 1,660 miles from Hong Kong."
"Only 1,600.
"It's the same thing."
Fix breathed more freely.
"But it might be arranged some other way."
Fix ceased to breathe at all.
"How?" "By going to Nagasaki, the extreme south of Japan, or even to Shanghai, which is 800 miles from here. In going to Shanghai, we wouldn't be forced to sail wide of the Chinese coast. That'd be a great advantage, as the currents run northward and would aid us."
"Pilot, I must make the American steamer at Yokohama, and not at Shanghai or Nagasaki."
"Why not? San Francisco steamer doesn't start from Yokohama. Puts in at Yokohama and Nagasaki, but it starts from Shanghai."
"You're sure of that?"
"Perfectly."
"And when does the boat leave Shanghai?"
On the 11th at 7 in the evening. We have 4 days ahead of us then. 96 hours. In that time, if we had some good luck and a southwest wind and the sea was calm, we could make those 800 miles to Shanghai."
"And you would go?"
"In an hour, as soon as provisions can be got aboard and the sails put up."
"It's a bargain. Are you the master of the boat?"
"Yes, John Bunsby, master of the Tankadeer."
"Would you like some earnest money?"
"If it wouldn't put your honor out."
"Here are £200 on account, sir," added Phileas Fogg, turning to Fix, "if you'd like to take advantage."
"Oh, thanks, sir. I was about to ask the favor."
"Very well. In half an hour we shall go on board." "But poor Passepartout?" "I shall do all I can to find him." While Fix, in a feverish, nervous state, repaired to the pilot boat, the others directed their course to the police station at Hong Kong. Phileas Fogg there gave Passepartout's description, and left a sum of money to be spent in search for him. the same formalities having been gone through at the French consulate, and the palanquin being stopped at the hotel for the luggage which had been sent back there, they returned to the wharf. It was now 3 o'clock, and pilot boat number 43, with its crew on board and provisions stored away, was ready for departure. The Tankadere was a little neat craft of 20 tons, as gracefully built as if she was a racing yacht. Her shining copper sheathing, her galvanized ironwork, her deck, white as ivory, betrayed the pride taken by John Bunsby in making her presentable. Her two masts leaned a trifle backward. She carried brigantine, foresail, storm jib, and standing jib, and was well rigged for running before the wind, and she seemed capable of brisk speed, which, indeed, she had already proved by gaining several prizes in pilot boat races. The crew of the Tankadere was composed of John Bunsby, the master, and 4 hardy mariners who were familiar with the Chinese seas. John Bunsby himself, a man of 45 or thereabouts, was vigorous, sunburnt, and had a sprightly expression of the eye. He was energetic and had a self-reliant countenance. He would have inspired confidence in the most timid. Phileas Fogg and Audo went on board, where they found Fix already installed. Below deck was a square cabin, of which the walls bulged out in the form of cots. Above, a circular divan. In the center was a table provided with a swinging lamp. The accommodation was confined, but neat. "I'm sorry to have nothing better to offer you," said Mr. Fogg to Fix, who bowed without responding. The detective had a feeling akin to humiliation in profiting by the kindness of Mr. Fogg.
"It's certain, though rascal as he is a polite one," thought he.
The sails and the English flag were hoisted at 10 minutes past 3. Mr. Fogg and Auda, who were seated on deck, cast a last glance at the quay, in hopes of spying Passepartout. Fix was not without his fears, lest chance should direct the steps of the unfortunate servant whom he had so badly treated in this direction, in which case an explanation, the reverse of satisfactory to the detective, must have ensued. But the Frenchman didn't appear, and without doubt was still lying under the stupefying influence of the opium. John Bunsby, master, at length gave the order to start, and the Tankadere, taking the wind under a brigantine, foresail, and standing jib, bounded briskly forward over the waves. Chapter 21, in which the master of the Tankadere runs great risk of losing a reward of £200. This voyage of 800 miles was a perilous venture on a craft of 20 tons, and especially at that season of the year. The Chinese seas are usually boisterous and subject to terrible gales of wind, and especially so during the equinoxes, and it was now early November. It would clearly have been to the master's advantage to carry his passengers to Yokohama, since he was paid a certain sum per day, but he would have been rash to attempt such a voyage, and it was imprudent even to attempt to reach Shanghai. But Bunsby believed in the Tankadere, which rode on the waves like a seagull, and perhaps he wasn't wrong. Late in the day they passed through the capricious tunnels of Hong Kong, and the Tankadere, impelled by favorable winds, conducted herself admirably. "I do not need, pilot," said Phileas Fogg when they got into the open sea, "to advise you to use all possible speed."
Trust me, Your Honor. We're carrying all the sail the wind can let us. The poles had had nothing, and were only used when we were going into port."
"It's your trade, not mine, pilot. I confide in you." Phileas Fogg, with posture erect and legs wide apart, stood like a sailor, gazed without staggering at the swelling waters. The young woman, who was seated aft, was profoundly affected as she looked out upon the ocean, darkening now with the twilight, on which she had ventured in so frail a vessel. Above her head rustled the white sails, which seemed like great white wings. The boat, carried forward by the wind, seemed to be flying in the air. Night came. The moon was entering her first quarter, and her insufficient light... Hang on. I lost my place. The moon was entering her first quarter, and her insufficient light would soon die out in the mist on the horizon. Clouds were rising from the east, and already overcast a part of the heavens. The pilot had hung out his lights, which was very necessary in these seas crowded with vessels bound landward, for collisions are not uncommon occurrences, and at the speed she was going the least shock would shatter the gallant little craft. Fix, seated in the bow, gave himself up to meditation. He kept apart from his fellow travelers, knowing Mr. Fogg's taciturn tastes. Besides, he didn't quite like to talk to the man whose favors he had accepted. He was thinking, too, of the future. It seemed certain that Fogg would not stop at Yokohama, but would at once take the boat for San Francisco, and the vast extent of America would assure him impunity and safety. Fogg's plan appeared to him the simplest in the world. Instead of sailing directly from England to the United States, like a common villain, he'd traverse 3/4 of the globe, so as to gain the American continent more surely. And there, after throwing the police off his back, he'd quietly enjoy himself with a fortune stolen from the bank. But once in the United States, what should he, Fix, do? Should he abandon this man? No, not 100 times so. Until he had secured his extradition, he would not lose sight of him for an hour. It was his duty, and he would fulfill it to the end. At all events, there was one thing to be thankful for. Passepartout was not with his master, and it was above all important, after the confidences Fix had imparted to him, that the servant should never have speech with his master. Phileas Fogg was also thinking of Passepartout, who had so strangely disappeared. Looking at the matter from every point of view, well, it did not seem to him impossible that by some mistake the man might have embarked on the Carnatic at the last moment. This was also Auda's opinion, who regretted very much the loss of the worthy fellow to whom she owed so much. They then might find him at Yokohama, for if the Carnatic was carrying him thither, it would be easy to ascertain if he had been on board. A brisk breeze arose about 10 o'clock, but though it might have been prudent to take in a reef, the pilot, after carefully examining the heavens, let the craft remain rigged as before. The Tankadere bore sail admirably, as she drew a great deal of water, and everything was prepared for high speed in case of a gale. Mr. Fogg and Auda descended into the cabin at midnight, having already been preceded by Fix, who had lain down on one of the cots. The pilot and crew remained on deck all night. At sunrise the next day, which was 8th November, the boat had made more than 100 miles. The log indicated a mean speed of between 8 and 9 miles. The Tankadere still carried all sail, and was accomplishing her greatest capacity of speed. If the wind held as it was, the chances would be in her favor. During the day she kept along the coast, where the currents were favorable. The coast, irregular in profile and visible sometimes among the clearings, was at most 5 miles distant. The sea was less boisterous, since the wind came off land, a fortunate circumstance for the boat, which would suffer, owing to its small tonnage, by a heavy surge on the sea. The breeze subsided a little towards noon, and set in from the southwest. The pilot put up his poles, but took them down again within 2 hours, as the wind freshened up anew. Mr. Fogg and Auda, happily unaffected by the roughness of the sea, ate with a good appetite, Fix being invited to share the repast, which he accepted with secret chagrin. To travel at this man's expense and to live upon his provisions was not palatable to him. Still, he was obliged to eat, and so he ate. When the meal was over, he took Mr. Fogg apart and said, "Sir," this "sir" scorched his lips, and he had controlled himself to avoid collaring the gentleman. "Sir, you've been very kind to give me a passage on this boat, but though my means will not admit of my expending them as freely as you, I must ask to pay my share." "Let us not speak of that, sir."
But if I insist—"
"No, sir," repeated Mr. Fogg in a tone which did not admit of a reply. "This enters into my general expenses." Fix, as he bowed, had a stifled feeling, and going forward, where he ensconced himself, didn't open his mouth for the rest of the day. Meanwhile, they were progressing famously, and John Bunsby was in high hope. He several times assured Mr. Fogg they would reach Shanghai in time, to which that gentleman responded that he counted upon it. The crew set to work in good earnest, inspired by the reward to be gained. There was not a sheet which was not tightened, not a sail which was not vigorously hoisted, not a lurch that could be charged to the man at the helm. They worked as desperately as if they were contesting in a royal yacht regatta. By evening the log showed them that 220 miles had been accomplished from Hong Kong, and Mr. Fogg might hope that he'd be able to reach Yokohama without recording any delay in his journal, in which case the many misadventures which had overtaken him since he'd left London wouldn't seriously affect his journey. The Tankadeer entered the Straits of Fukien, which separate the island of Formosa from the Chinese coast, in the small hours of the night, and crossed the Tropic of Cancer. The sea was very rough in the straits, full of eddies formed by the countercurrents, and the chopping waves broke her course, while it became very difficult to stand on deck. At daybreak, the wind began to blow hard again, and the heavens seemed to predict a gale. The barometer announced a speedy change, the mercury rising and falling capriciously. The sea was also in the southeast, raising long surges which indicated a tempest. The sun had set the evening before in a red mist in the midst of the phosphorescent scintillations of the ocean. John Bunsby long examined the threatening aspect of the heavens, muttering indistinctly between his teeth, and at last he said in a voice to Mr. Fogg, "Shall I speak out to your honor?" "Of course." "Well, we're gonna have a squall." Is the wind north or south?" "South. Look, a typhoon's coming up." "Glad it's a typhoon from the south that'll carry us forward." "Well, if you take it that way, I've got nothing more to say." John Bunsby's suspicions were confirmed. At a less advanced season of the year, the typhoon, according to a famous meteorologist, would have passed away like a luminous cascade of electric flame, but in the winter equinox it was to be feared that it would burst upon them with, great violence. The pilot took his precautions in advance. He reefed all sail, the pole masts were dispensed with, and all hands went forward to the bows. A single triangular sail of strong canvas was hoisted as a storm jib, so as to hold the wind from behind, and then they waited. Bunsby requested his passengers to go below, but this imprisonment in such a narrow space, with little air and the boat bouncing in the gale, was far from pleasant. Neither Fogg, Fix, nor Outa consented to leave the deck. The storm of rain and wind descended upon them towards 8 o'clock. With but its bit of sail, the Tankadeer was lifted like a feather by the wind, an idea of whose violence can scarcely be given. To compare her speed to 4 times of that of a locomotive going on full speed would be below the truth. The boat scudded thus northward during the whole day, borne on by monstrous waves, preserving always, fortunately, a speed equal to theirs. 20 times she seemed almost to be submerged by these mountains of water which rose behind her, but the adroit management of the pilot saved her. The passengers were often bathed in spray, but they submitted to it philosophically. Fix cursed it, no doubt, but Outa, with her eyes fastened upon her protector, whose coolness amazed her, showed herself worthy of him and bravely weathered the storm. As for Phileas Fogg, it just seemed as if the typhoon were part of his program. Up to this time the Tankadeer had always held her course to the north, but towards evening the wind, veering 3/4, bore down from the northwest. The boat, now lying in the trough of the waves, shook and rolled terribly. The sea struck her with fearful violence. At night the tempest increased in violence, and John Bunsby saw the approach of darkness and the rising of the storm with dark misgivings. He thought a while, and then asked his crew if it was not time to slacken speed. After a consultation, he approached Mr. Fogg and said, "I think, Your Honor, we should do well to make for one of the ports on the coast." "I think so, too." Yes, but which one?" "I know of but one."
"And that is?"
"Shanghai." The pilot at first didn't seem to comprehend. He could scarcely realize so much determination and tenacity. And then he cried,
"Well, yes, Your Honor's right. To Shanghai."
So the Tankadeer kept steadily on her northward track. The night was really terrible. It'd be a miracle if the craft didn't founder. Twice it would have been all over with her, if the crew had not constantly been in the watch. Aouda was exhausted, but she didn't utter a complaint. More than once Mr. Fogg rushed to protect her from the violence of the waves. Day reappeared, and the tempest still raged with undiminished fury, but the wind now returned to the southeast. It was a favorable change, and the Tangadeer again bounded forward on the mountainous sea, though the waves crossed each other and imparted shocks and countershocks which would have crushed a craft less solidly built. From time to time the coast was visible through the broken mist, but no vessel was in sight. The Tangadeer was alone upon the sea. There were some signs of a calm at noon, and these became more distinct as the sun descended toward the horizon. The tempest had been as brief as it was terrific. The passengers, thoroughly exhausted, could now eat a little and take some repose. The night was comparatively quiet. Some of the sails were again hoisted, and the speed of the boat was very good. The next morning at dawn they espied the coast, and John Bunsby was able to assert that they were not 100 miles from Shanghai. 100 miles, and only one day to traverse them. That very evening Mr. Fogg was due at Shanghai, if he didn't wish to miss the steamer to Yokohama. Had there been no storm, during which several hours were lost, they'd be at this moment within 30 miles of their destination. The wind grew decidedly calmer, and happily the sea fell with it. All the sails were hoisted, and at noon the Tangadeer was within 45 miles of Shanghai. There remained yet 6 hours in which to accomplish the distance. All on board feared it couldn't be done, and every one, Phileas Fogg no doubt excepted, felt his heart beat with impatience. The boat must keep up an average of 9 miles an hour, and the wind was becoming calmer every moment. It was a capricious breeze, coming from the coast, and after it passed the sea became smooth. Still the Tangadeer was so light, and her fine sails caught the fickle zephyrs so well, that with the aid of the currents, John Bunsby found himself at 6 o'clock not more than 10 miles from the mouth of the Shanghai River. Shanghai itself was situated at least 12 miles up the stream. At 7 they were still 3 miles from Shanghai. The pilot swore an angry oath. The reward of £200 was evidently on the point of escaping him. He looked at Mr. Fogg, and Mr. Fogg was perfectly tranquil, and yet his whole fortune was at this moment at stake. At this moment also, a long black funnel, crowned with wreaths of smoke, appeared on the edge of the waters. It was the American steamer, leaving for Yokohama at the appointed time. "Confounded!" cried Bunsby, pushing back the rudder with a desperate jerk. "Signal her," said Fogg quietly. A small brass cannon stood in the forward deck of the Tangadeer for making signals in the fogs. It was loaded to the muzzle, but just as the pilot was about to apply a red-hot coal to the touch-hole, Mr. Fogg said, "Hoist your flag." The flag was run up at half-mast, and this being the signal of distress, it was hoped that the American steamer, perceiving it, would change her course a little, so as to succour the pilot-boat. "Fire," said Mr. Fogg, and the booming of the little cannon resounded in the air. Okay, folks, so we're about an hour in, and we're at a chapter boundary. So I'm going to take a moment to go get some water, get moving around. I invite you all to do the same. It's always good to, not sit still for too long. Don't want to get the blood sitting still in your legs. And if you got some calories, have a snack. If you don't, there's always water or tea to have. But we'll see you in a moment. Be right back. Okay. Welcome back. I hope you paused the video to get your snack and whatnot, because that's why I only give you a short moment for the intermission. Let's get right back into it. Oh goodness, I'm very sorry about that nose noise. Oh, sorry. Anyway, let's get right back into it with chapter 22. And fun fact, we've got 15 chapters left. At least if this particular count of chapters is correct that I've found. Anyway, chapter 22, in which Passepartout finds out that even at the Antipodes it's convenient to have some money in one's pocket. The Carnatic, setting sail from Hong Kong at 6:30 on the 7th of November, directed her course at full steam towards Japan. She carried a large cargo and a well-filled cabin of passengers. 2 staterooms in their rear were, however, unoccupied, those which had been engaged by Phileas Fogg. The next day, a passenger with a half-stupefied eye, staggering gait, and disordered hair was seen to emerge from the second cabin, and to totter to a seat on deck. It was Passepartout, and what had happened to him was as follows. Shortly after Fix had left the opium den, 2 waiters had lifted the unconscious Passepartout and carried him to the bed reserved for the smokers. 3 hours later, pursued even in his dreams by a fixed idea, the poor fellow awoke and struggled against the stupefying influence of the narcotic. The thought of a duty unfulfilled shook off his torpor, and he hurried from the abode of drunkenness, staggering and holding himself up by keeping against the walls, falling down and creeping up again, and irresistibly impelled by a kind of instinct, he kept crying out, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" The steamer lay puffing alongside the quay, on the point of starting. Passepartout had but a few steps to go, and, rushing upon the plank, he crossed it, and fell unconscious on the deck just as the Carnatic was moving off. Several sailors, who were evidently accustomed to this sort of scene, carried the poor Frenchman down into the second cabin, and Passepartout did not wake until they were 150 miles away from China. Thus he found himself, the next morning, on the deck of the Carnatic, and eagerly inhaling the exhilarating sea breeze. The pure air sobered him. He began to collect his senses, which he found a difficult task, but at last he recalled the events of the evening before, Fix's revelation, and the opium house. "It is evident," he said to himself, "that I have been abominably drunk. What will Monsieur Fogg say? At least I have not missed the steamer, which is the most important thing." Then as Fix occurred to him, "As for that rascal, I hope we are well rid of him, and that he has not dared, as he proposed, to follow us on board the Carnatic. A detective on the track of Monsieur Fogg, accused of robbing the Bank of England. Pshaw! Monsieur Fogg is no more a robber than I am a murderer." Should he divulge Fix's real errand to his master? Would it do to tell the part the detective was playing? Would it not be better to wait until Mr. Fogg reached London again, and then impart to him that an agent of the Metropolitan Police had been following him round the world, and have a good laugh over it? No doubt, at least, it was worth considering. The first thing to do was to find Mr. Fogg and apologize for his singular behavior. Passepartout got up and proceeded, as well as he could with the rolling of the steamer anyway, to the afterdeck. He saw no one who resembled either his master or Aouda. "Oh, good. Aouda has not gotten up yet, and Monsieur Fogg has probably found some partners at whist." He descended to the saloon, and Mr. Fogg was not there. Passepartout had only, however, to ask the purser the number of his master's stateroom. The purser replied he didn't know any passenger by the name of Fogg. "I beg your pardon. He's a tall gentleman, quiet, and not very talkative, and he has with him a young lady."
"There's no young lady on board. Here's a list of the passengers. You can see for yourself."
Passepartout scanned the list, but his master's name was not upon it. And all at once an idea struck him. Am I on the Carnatic?"
"Yes."
"On the way to Yokohama?"
"Certainly."
Passepartout had for an instant feared that he was on the wrong boat, but though he was really on the Carnatic, his master was not here. He fell thunderstruck on a seat. He saw it all now. He remembered that the time of the sailing had been changed, that he should have informed his master of that fact, and that he had not done so. It was his fault, then, that Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the steamer. And yes, it was but still more the fault of the traitor, who, in order to separate him from his master and detain the latter at Hong Kong, had inveigled him into getting drunk. He now saw the detective's trick, and at this moment Mr. Fogg was certainly ruined. His bet was lost, and he himself perhaps arrested and imprisoned. At this thought, Passepartout tore his hair. Oh, if Fix ever came within his reach, what a settling of accounts there'd be! After this initial depression, Passepartout became calmer and began to study the situation. It was certainly not an enviable one. He found himself on the way to Japan, and what should he do when he got there? His pocket was empty. He had not a solitary shilling, not so much as a penny. His passage had fortunately been paid for in advance, and he had had 5 or 6 days in which to decide upon his future course. He fell to, at meals with an appetite, and ate for Mr. Fogg, Ouda, and himself. If he helped himself as generously as if Japan were a desert, where nothing to eat was to be looked for. At dawn on the 13th, the Carnatic entered the port of Yokohama. This is an important port of call in the Pacific, where all the mail steamers and those carrying travelers between North America, China, Japan, and the Oriental Islands put in. It's situated in the Bay of Yedo, and at but a short distance from the second capital of the Japanese Empire, and the residence of the Tycoon, the civil emperor, before the Mikado, the spiritual emperor, absorbed his office in his own. The Carnatic anchored at the quay near the custom house, in the midst of a crowd of ships bearing the flags of all nations. Passepartout went timidly ashore on this so curious territory of the Sons of the Sun. He had nothing better to do than, taking chance for his guide, to wander aimlessly through the streets of Yokohama. He found himself at first in a thoroughly European quarter, the houses having low fronts and being adorned with verandas, beneath which he caught glimpses of neat peristyles. This quarter occupied, with its streets, squares, docks, and warehouses, all the space between the promontory of the treaty and the river. Here, as at Hong Kong and Calcutta, were mixed crowds of all races, American, English, Chinamen, Dutchmen, mostly merchants, ready to buy or sell anything. The Frenchman felt himself as much alone among them as he had dropped down in the midst of Hottentots. But he had at least one resource to call on, the French and English consuls at Yokohama, for assistance. But he shrank from telling the story of his adventures, intimately connected as it was with that of his master, and before doing so he determined to exhaust all other means of aid. As chance did not favor him in the European quarter, he penetrated that inhabited by the native Japanese, determined, if necessary, to push on to Yedo. The Japanese quarter of Yokohama is called Benten, after the goddess of the sea, who is worshipped on the islands round about. There Passepartout beheld beautiful fir and cedar groves, sacred gates of a singular architecture, bridges half hidden in the midst of bamboos and reeds, temples shaded by immense cedar trees, holy retreats, where were sheltered Buddhist priests and secretaries of Confucius, and interminable streets, where a perfect harvest of rose-tinted and red-cheeked children, who looked as if they had been cut out of Japanese screens, and who were playing in the midst of short-legged poodles and yellowish cats, might have been gathered. The streets were crowded with people. Priests were passing in processions, beating their dreary tambourines. Police and custom-house officers, with pointed hats encrusted with lac, and carrying 2 sabres hung to their waists. Soldiers clad in blue cotton with white stripes and bearing guns. The Mikado's guards, enveloped in silken doubles, hauberks, and coats of mail, and numbers of military folk of all ranks, for the military profession is as much respected in Japan as it is despised in China, went hither and thither in groups and pairs. Passepartout saw, too, begging friars, long-robed pilgrims, and simple civilians with their warped and jet-black hair, large heads, long busts, slender legs, short stature, and complexions varying from copperish to a dead white, but never yellow like the Chinese, from whom the Japanese widely differ.
Yikes. Like, there's a lot of things that are kind of yikes in this book that I've been trying to filter out. Like, I get it, it's from, like, the 1920s, but, like, oof, sometimes it's just a little heavy-handed about the race stuff. Anyway.
He didn't fail to observe the curious equipages, carriages and palanquins, barrows supplied with sails, and litters made of bamboo, nor the women, who he thought not especially handsome, who took little steps with their little feet, whereon they wear canvas shoes, straw sandals, and clogs of worked wood, and who displayed tight-looking eyes, flat chests, teeth fashionably blackened, and gowns crossed with silken scarfs, tied in an enormous knot behind an ornament which the modern Parisian ladies seem to have borrowed from the dames of Japan. I almost said James of Japan. That's not it. That's a spoonerism. Passepartout wandered for several hours in the midst of this motley crowd, looking in at the windows of the rich and curious shops, the jewelry establishments glittering with quaint Japanese ornaments, the restaurants decked with streamers and banners, the tea houses where the odorous beverage was being drunk with sake, a liquor concocted from the fermentation of rice, and the comfortable smoking houses where they were puffing not opium, which is almost unknown in Japan, but a very fine, very stringy tobacco. He went on until he found himself in the fields, in the midst of vast rice plantations. There he saw dazzling camellias expanding themselves, with flowers which were giving forth their last colors and perfumes, not on bushes, but on trees, and within bamboo enclosures, cherry, plum, and apple trees, which the Japanese cultivate rather for their blossoms than their fruit, and which queerly fashioned, grinning scarecrows protected from the sparrows, pigeons, ravens, and other voracious birds. On the branches of the cedars were perched large eagles, and the foliage of the weeping willows were herons. Solemnly standing on their one leg, and on every hand were crows, ducks, hawks, wild birds, and a multitude of cranes, which the Japanese consider sacred, and which to their minds symbolized long life and prosperity. As he was strolling along, Passepartout espied some violets among the shrubs. "Good, I'll have some supper." But on smelling them he found that they were odorless. No chance there, he thought. The worthy fellow had certainly taken good care to eat as hearty a breakfast as possible before leaving the Carnatic, but he had been walking about all day, and the demands of hunger were becoming importunate. He observed that the butcher's stalls contained neither mutton, goat, nor pork, and knowing also that it is a sacrilege to kill cattle, which are preserved solely for farming, he made up his mind that meat was far from plentiful in Yokohama. Nor was he mistaken, and in a default of butcher's meat, he could have wished for a quarter of wild boar or deer, a partridge or some quails, some game or fish, which, with rice, the Japanese eat almost exclusively. But he found it necessary to keep up a stout heart, and to postpone the meal he craved until the following morning. Night came, and Passepartout re-entered the native quarter, where he wandered through the streets, lit by various colored lanterns, looking on at the dancers who were executing skillful steps and boundings, and the astrologers who stood in the open air with their telescopes. And then he came to the harbor, which was lit up by the resin torches of the fishermen who were fishing from their boats. The streets at last became quiet, and the patrol, the officers of which in their splendid costumes and surrounded by their suites, Passepartout thought seemed like ambassadors, succeeded the bustling crowd. Each time a company passed, Passepartout chuckled and said to himself, "Good, another Japanese embassy departing for Europe." Chapter 23, in which Passepartout's nose becomes outrageously long. The next morning, poor, jaded, famished Passepartout said to himself that he must get something to eat at all hazards, and the sooner he did so the better. He might indeed sell his watch, but he would have starved first. Now or never he must use the strong, if not melodious voice which nature had bestowed upon him. He knew several French and English songs, and resolved to try them upon the Japanese, who must be lovers of music, for they were ever pounding on their cymbals, tambourines, and drums, and could not but appreciate a European talent. It was perhaps rather early in the morning to get up to a concert, and the audience, prematurely roused from their slumbers, might not possibly pay their entertainer with coin bearing the Mikado's features. Passepartout therefore decided to wait several hours, and as he was sauntering along, it occurred to him that he would seem rather too well dressed for a wandering artist. The idea struck him to change his garments for clothes more in harmony with his project, by which he might also get a little money to satisfy the immediate cravings of hunger. The resolution taken, it remained to carry it out. It was only after a long search that Passepartout discovered a native dealer in old clothes, to whom he applied for an exchange. The man liked the European costume, and ere long Passepartout issued from his shop, accoutred in an old Japanese coat, and a sort of one-sided turban faded with long use. A few small pieces of silver, moreover, jingled in his pocket. "Oh, good! I will imagine I am at the carnival." His first care, after being thus inducted, was to enter a tea-house of modest appearance, and upon half a bird and a little rice, to breakfast like a man for whom dinner was as yet a problem to be solved. "Now," thought he, when he had eaten heartily, "I mustn't lose my head.
I can't sell this costume again for one still more Japanese. I must consider how to leave this country of the sun, of which I shall not retain the most delightful of memories, as quickly as possible.
It occurred to him to visit the steamers which were about to leave for America. He'd offer himself as a cook or servant in payment of his passage and meals. Once at San Francisco, he'd find some means of going on. The difficulty was how to traverse the 4,700 miles of the Pacific which lay between Japan and the New World. Passepartout was not the man to let an idea go begging, and directed his steps toward the docks. But as he approached them, his project, which at first seemed so simple, began to grow more and more formidable to his mind. What need would they have a cook or a servant on an American steamer, and what confidence would they put him in, dressed as he was? What references could he give? As he was reflecting in this wise, his eyes fell upon an immense placard which a sort of clown was carrying through the streets. This placard, which was in English, read as follows:
Acrobatic Japanese troupe, Honorable William Battlecar, proprietor, last representations prior to their departure to the United States of the Long Noses, under the direct patronage of the god Tingo, great attraction.
The United States, that's just what I want.
And so he followed the clown, and soon found himself once more in the Japanese quarter. A quarter of an hour later, he stopped before a large cabin, adorned with several clusters of streamers, the exterior walls of which were designed to represent, in violent colors and without perspective, a company of jugglers. This was the Honorable William Baltucar's establishment. The gentleman was a sort of Barnum, the director of a troupe of mountebanks, jugglers, clowns, acrobats, equilibrists, and gymnasts, who, according to the placard, was giving his last performances before leaving the Empire of the Sun for the States of the Union. Passepartout entered and asked for Mr. Battlecar, who straightway appeared in person.
"What do you want?"
he said to Passepartout, whom he at first took for a native.
"Would you care for a servant, sir?"
"Your servant?" cried Mr. Battlecar, caressing his thick grey beard which hung from his chin.
I already have two who are obedient and faithful. They've never left me. They serve me their nourishment, and there they are,"
said he, holding out his two robust arms, furrowed with veins as large as the strings of a bass viol.
"So I can be of no use to you?"
"None."
"Never. I should so like to cross the Pacific with you."
"Ah," said the Honorable Mr. Battlecar,
"You're no more Japanese than I am a monkey. Why are you dressed up that way?"
"Your man dresses as he can."
"That's true. You're a Frenchman, aren't you?"
"Yes, a Parisian of Paris."
"Then you ought to know how to make grimaces."
"Why," replied Passepartout, a little vexed that his nationality should cause this question, "we Frenchmen know how to make grimaces, it is true, but not any better than the Americans do."
"True. Well, if I can't take you as a servant, I can't take you as a clown.
You see, my friend, in France they exhibit foreign clowns, and in foreign parts French clowns."
You're pretty strong, huh?"
"Especially after a good meal."
"And can you sing?"
"Yes," returned Passepartout, who had been formerly wont to sing in the streets.
"But can you sing standing on your head with a top spinning on your left foot and a saber balanced on your right?"
"I think so," replied Passepartout, recalling the exercises of his younger days.
"Well, that's enough,"
said the Honorable William Battlecar, and the engagement was concluded there and then. Passepartout had at last found something to do. He was engaged to act in the celebrated Japanese troupe. It was not a very dignified position, but within a week he would be on his way to San Francisco. The performance, so noisily announced by the Honorable Mr. Battlecar, was to commence at 3 o'clock, and soon the deafening instruments of a Japanese orchestra resounded at the door. Passepartout, though he had not been able to study or rehearse a part, was designated to lend the aid of his sturdy shoulders in the great exhibition of the human pyramid, executed by the long noses of the god Tingu. This great attraction was to close the performance. Before 3 o'clock, the large shed was invaded by spectators, comprising Europeans and natives, Chinese and Japanese, men, women, and children, who precipitated themselves upon the narrow benches and into the boxes opposite the stage. The musicians took up a position inside and were vigorously performing on their gongs, tam-tams, flutes, bones, tambourines, and immense drums. The performance was so much like all acrobatic displays, but it must be confessed that the Japanese are first equilibrists in the world. One, with a fan and some bits of paper, performed the graceful trick of the butterflies and the flowers. Another traced in the air, with the odorous smoke of his pipe, a series of blue words which composed a compliment to the audience, while the third juggled some lighted candles, which he extinguished successively as they passed his lips, and relit again without interrupting for an instant his juggling. Another reproduced the most singular combinations with a spinning top. In his hands the revolving tops seemed to be animated with a life of their own in their indeterminable whirring. They ran over pipe stems, the edges of sabers, wires, and even hairs stretched across the stage. They turned around on the edges of large glasses, crossed bamboo ladders, dispersed into all the corners, and produced strange musical effects by the combination of their various pitches of tone. The jugglers tossed them in the air, threw them like shuttlecocks with their wooden battledores, and yet they kept on spinning. They put them into their pockets and took them out, still whirling as before. It's useless to describe the astonishing performances of the acrobats and gymnasts. The turning on ladders, poles, balls, barrels, etc., was executed with wonderful precision. But the principal attraction was the exhibition of the long noses, a show to which Europe is, as yet, a stranger. The long noses form a peculiar company, under the direct patronage of the god Tingu. Attired after the fashion of the Middle Ages, they bore upon their shoulders a splendid pair of wings, but what especially distinguished them was the long noses which were attached to their faces, and the uses of which they made them. These noses were made of bamboo, and were 5, 6, and even 10 feet long, some straight, some curved, some ribboned, and some having some imitation warts upon them. It was upon these appendages, fixed tightly on their real noses, that they performed their gymnastic exercises. A dozen of these secretaries of Tingu lay flat upon their backs, while others, dressed to represent lightning rods, came and frolicked on their noses, jumping from one to another, and performing the most skilful leapings and somersaults. At the last scene a human pyramid had been announced, in which 50 long noses were to represent the car of Juggernaut. But instead of performing a pyramid by mounting each other's shoulders, the artists were to group themselves on top of the noses. It happened that the performer who had hitherto formed the base of the car had quitted the trope, and so as to fill this part, only strength and adroitness were necessary. Passepartout had been chosen to take his place. The poor fellow really felt sad when, melancholy reminiscence of his youth, he donned his costume, adorned with various colored wings, and fastened to his natural feature a false nose 6 feet long. But he cheered up when he thought that this nose was winning him something to eat. He went upon the stage and took his place beside the rest who were to compose the base of the car of Juggernaut. They all stretched themselves upon the floor, their noses pointing to the ceiling. A second group of artists disposed themselves on these long appendages, and then a third above these, and then a fourth. A human monument, reaching to the very cornices of the theatre, soon arose on top of the noses. This elicited loud applause, in the midst of which the orchestra was just striking up a deafening air. And when the pyramid tottered, the balance was lost, one of the lower noses vanished from the pyramid, and the human monument was shattered like a castle built of cards. It was Passepartout's fault. Abandoning his position, clearing the footlights, without the aid of his wings, and clambering up to the right-hand gallery, he fell at the feet of one of the spectators, crying, my master, my master. You here? Myself. Very well. Then let us go to the steamer, young man. Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout passed through the lobby of the theatre to the outside, where they encountered the Honourable Mr. Battlecar, furious with rage. He demanded damages for the breakage of the pyramid, and Phileas Fogg appeased him by giving him a handful of banknotes. At 6:30, the very hour of departure, Mr. Fogg and Aouda, followed by Passepartout, who in his hurry had retained his wings and nose 6 feet long, stepped upon the American steamer. Chapter 24, during which Mr. Fogg and party crossed the Pacific Ocean. What happened when the pilot boat came in sight of Shanghai will be easily guessed. The signals made by the Tankadere had been seen by the captain of the Yokohama steamer, who, espying the flag at half-mast, had directed his course toward the little craft. Phileas Fogg, after paying the stipulated price of his passage to John Busby, and rewarding that worthy with the additional sum of £550, ascended the steamer with Aouda and Fix, and they started at once for Nagasaki and Yokohama. They reached their destination on the morning of the 14th of November. Phileas Fogg had lost no time in going on board the Carnatic, where he learned, to Aouda's great delight, and perhaps to his own, though he betrayed no emotion, that Passepartout, a Frenchman, had really arrived on her the day before. The San Francisco steamer was announced to leave that very evening, and it became necessary to find Passepartout, if possible, without delay. Mr. Fogg applied in vain to the French and English consuls, and after wandering through the streets a long time, began to despair of finding his missing servant. Chance, or perhaps a kind of presentiment, at last led him into the Honourable Mr. Battleclyre's theatre. He certainly wouldn't have recognized Passepartout in the eccentric mountebank's costume, but the latter, lying on his back, perceived his master in the gallery. He couldn't help staring, which so changed the condition of his nose, to bring the pyramid pell-mell upon the stage. All this Passepartout learned from Aouda, who had recounted to him what had taken place on the voyage from Hong Kong to Shanghai on the Tankadere, in company with one Mr. Fix. Passepartout didn't change countenance on hearing this name. He thought that the time had not yet arrived to divulge to his master what had taken place between the detective and himself, and in the account he gave of his absence, he simply excused himself for having been overtaken by drunkenness, in smoking opium at a tavern in Hong Kong. Mr. Fogg heard this narrative coldly, without a word, and then furnished his man with funds necessary to obtain clothing more in harmony with his position. Within an hour the Frenchman had cut off his nose and parted with the wings, and retained nothing about him which recalled the sectary of the god Tingu. The steamer was about to depart from Yokohama to San Francisco, belonged to the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and was named the General Grant. It was a large paddle-wheel steamer of 2,500 tons, well equipped and very fast. The massive walking beam rose and fell above the deck. At one end a piston rod worked up and down, and at the other was a connecting rod in which, changing the rectilinear motion to circular one, was directly connected with the shaft of the paddles. The General Grant was rigged with 3 masts, given a large capacity for sails, and thus materially aiding the steam power. By making 12 miles an hour, she would cross the ocean in 21 days. Phileas Fogg was therefore justified in hoping that he could reach San Francisco by the 2nd of December, New York by the 11th, and London on the 20th, thus gaining several hours on the fatal date of the 21st of December. There was a full complement of passengers on board, among them English, many Americans, a number of coolies on their way to California, and several East Indian officers who were spending their vacation in making tour of the world. Nothing of moment happened on the voyage, but the steamer, sustained on its large paddles, rolled but little, and the Pacific almost justified its name. Mr. Fogg was calm and taciturn as ever. His young companion felt herself more and more attached to him by other ties than gratitude. His silent but generous nature impressed her more than she thought, and it was almost unconsciously that she yielded to emotions which didn't seem to have the least effect upon her protector. Aouda took the keenest interest in his plans and became impatient at any incident that seemed likely to halt his journey. She often chatted with Passepartout, who didn't fail to perceive the state of the lady's heart, and being the most faithful of domestics, he never exhausted these eulogies of Fogg's honesty, generosity, and devotion. He took pains to calm Aouda's doubts of the successful termination of the journey, telling her that the most difficult part of it had passed, and that now they were beyond the fantastic countries of China and Japan, they were fairly on their way to civilized places again. A railway train from San Francisco to New York, and a transatlantic steamer from New York to Liverpool, would doubtless bring them to the end of this impossible journey round the world within the period agreed upon. On the 9th day after leaving Yokohama, Phileas Fogg had traversed exactly 1/2 of the terrestrial globe. The General Grant passed on the 23rd of November the 180th meridian, and was at the very antipodes of London. Mr. Fogg had, it is true, exhausted 52 of the 80 days in which he was to complete the tour, and there were only 28 left. But though he was only halfway by the difference of meridians, he'd really gone over 2/3 of the whole journey, for he'd been obliged to make long circuits from London to Aden, and Aden to Bombay, and Calcutta to Singapore, and Singapore to Yokohama. Could he have followed without deviation the 50th parallel, which is that of London, the whole distance would have only been about 12,000 miles, whereas he would be forced by the irregular methods of locomotion to traverse 26,000, of which he had, on the 23rd of November, accomplished 17,500. And now the course was a straight one, and Fix was no longer there to put obstacles in their way. It happened also on the 23rd of November that Passepartout made a joyful discovery. It will be remembered that the obstinate fellow had insisted on keeping his famous family watch at London time, and on regarding that of the countries which he had passed through as quite false and unreliable. Now on this day, though he had not changed the hands, he found that his watch exactly agreed with the ship's chronometers. His triumph was hilarious. He'd like to know what Fix would say if he were aboard.
"The rogue told me a lot of stories about the meridians, the sun and the moon. Moon indeed, moonshine more likely. If one listened to that sort of people, a pretty sort of time one would keep. I was sure that the sun would some day regulate itself by my watch."
Passepartout was ignorant that if the face of his watch had been divided into 24 hours, like the Italian clocks, he'd have no reason for exultation, for the hands of his watch would then, instead of now indicating 9 o'clock in the morning, indicate 9 o'clock in the evening. That is the 21st hour after midnight, precisely the difference between London time and that of the 180th meridian. But if Fix had been able to explain this purely physical effect, Passepartout would not have admitted, even if he had comprehended it. Moreover, if the detective had been on board at that moment, Passepartout would have joined issue with him on a quite different subject, in an entirely different manner. Where was Fix at the moment? Well, he was actually on board the General Grant. On reaching Yokohama, the detective, leaving Mr. Fogg, whom he expected to meet again during the day, had repaired at once to the English consulate, where he had found the warrant of arrest. It followed him from Bombay, and had come by the Carnatic, on which steamer he himself was supposed to be. Fix's disappointment may be imagined when he reflected that the warrant was now useless. Mr. Fogg had left English ground. It was now necessary to procure his extradition.
"Well," thought Fix after a moment of anger, "my warrant isn't good here, but it will be in England. The rogue evidently intends to return to his own country, thinking he's trying the police off his track. Good. I'll follow him across the Atlantic. As for the money, heaven grant there might be some left. What the fellow has already spent in travelling, rewards, trial, bail, elephants, and all sorts of charges, more than £5,000. After all, the bank is rich."
His course decided on, he went on board the General Grant, and was there when Mr. Fogg and Ouda arrived. To his utter amazement, he recognized Passepartout despite his theatrical disguise. He quickly concealed himself in his cabin to avoid an awkward explanation, and hoped, thanks to the number of passengers, to remain unperceived by Mr. Fogg's servant. On that very day, however, he met Passepartout face to face on the forward deck. The latter, without a word, made a rush for him, grasped him by the throat, and much to the amusement of a group of Americans, who immediately began to bet on him, administered to the detective a perfect volley of blows, which proved the great superiority of French over English pugilistic skill. When Passepartout had finished, he found himself relieved and comforted. Fix got up in a somewhat rumpled condition, and looking at his adversary coldly, said, "Are you done?"
"For this time, yes."
"Then let me have a word with you."
"But in your master's interests."
Passepartout seemed to be vanquished by Fix's coolness, for he quietly followed him, and they sat down aside from the rest of the passengers.
"You giving me a thrashing? Good. I expected it. Now listen to me. Up to this time I've been Mr. Fogg's adversary. I'm now in his game." "Oh, you're convinced he's an honest man?" "No, I still think him a rascal." "No, don't budge and let me speak. As long as Mr. Fogg was on English ground, it was my interest to detain him till my warrant of arrest arrived. Did everything I could to keep him back. Sent the Bombay priests after him. I got you intoxicated at Hong Kong, separated you from him, and I made him miss the Yokohama steamer." Passepartout listened with closed fists. "Now, Mr. Fogg seems to be going back to England. I'll follow him there, but hereafter I'll do as much to keep obstacles out of his way as I've done up to this time to put him in his path. I've changed my game, you see, simply because it was for my interest to change it. Your interest is the same as mine. Well, it's only in England whether you're ascertained whether you're in the service of a criminal or an honest man. Passepartout listened very attentively to Fix, and convinced that he spoke with entirely good faith.
Are we friends?
Oh, friends? No. But allies, perhaps. At the least sign of treason, however, I'll twist your neck for you.
Agreed,
said the detective quietly, and 11 days later, on the 3rd of December, the General Grant entered the Bay of the Golden Gate and reached San Francisco. Mr. Fogg had neither gained nor had he lost a single day. Oh. Sorry, I had to snag some water before we started the next chapter. Chapter 25, in which a slight glimpse is had of San Francisco. It was 7 in the morning when Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Passepartout set foot upon the American continent, if this name can be given to the floating quay upon which they disembarked. These quays, rising and falling with the tide, thus facilitate the loading and unloading of vessels. Alongside them were clippers of all sizes, steamers of all nationalities, and steamboats with several decks rising one above the other, which ply on the Sacramento and its tributaries. They were also heaped up on the products of a commerce which extends to Mexico, Chile, Peru, Brazil, Europe, Asia, and all the Pacific Islands. Passepartout, in his joy on reaching at last the American continent, thought he would manifest it by executing a perilous vault in fine style, but tumbling upon some worm-eaten planks, he fell through them. Put out of countenance by the manner in which he thus set foot upon the new world, he uttered a loud cry, which so frightened the innumerable cormorants and pelicans that are always perched upon these movable quays that they flew noisily away. Mr. Fogg, upon reaching shore, proceeded to find out at what hour the first train left for New York, and learned that this was at 6:00 p.m. He had, therefore, an entire day to spend in the Californian capital. Taking a carriage at a charge of $3, he and Aouda entered it, while Passepartout mounted the box beside the driver, and they set out for the International Hotel. From his exalted position, Passepartout observed with much curiosity the wide streets, the low, evenly ranged houses, the Anglo-Saxon Gothic churches, the great docks, the palatial wooden and brick warehouses, the numerous conveyances, omnibuses, horse cars, and upon the sidewalks not only Americans and Europeans, but Chinese and Indians. Passepartout was surprised at all he saw. San Francisco was no longer the legendary city of 1849, a city of banditti, assassins, and incendiaries who had flocked hither in crowds, pursuit of plunder. A paradise of outlaws, where they gambled with gold dust, a revolver in one hand, a bowie knife in the other. It was now a great commercial emporium. The lofty tower of its city hall overlooked the whole panorama of the streets and avenues, which cut each other at right angles, and in the midst of which appeared pleasant verdant squares, while beyond appeared the Chinese Quarter, seemingly imported from the Celestial Empire into a toy box. Sombreros and red shirts and plumed Indians were rarely to be seen, but there were silk hats and black coats everywhere worn by a multitude of nervously active, gentlemanly-looking men. Some of the streets, especially Montgomery Street, which is to San Francisco what Regent Street is to London, the Boulevard des Italiens to Paris, and Broadway to New York, were lined with splendid and spacious stores, which exposed in their windows the products of the entire world. When Passepartout reached the International Hotel, it almost didn't seem to him as if he'd left England at all. The ground floor of the hotel was occupied by a large bar, a sort of restaurant, freely open to all passers-by, who might partake of dried beef, oyster soup, biscuits, and cheese, without taking out their purses. Payment was made only for the ale, porter, or sherry which was drunk. This seemed very American to Passepartout. The hotel refreshment rooms were comfortable, and Fogg and Aouda, installing themselves at a table, were abundantly served on diminutive plates. After breakfast, Mr. Fogg, accompanied by Aouda, started for the English consulate to have his passport visaed. As he was going out, he met Passepartout, who asked him if it would not be well, before taking the train, to purchase some dozens of Enfield rifles and Colt's revolvers. He had been listening to stories of attacks upon the trains by the Sioux and Pawnee,
Mr. Fogg thought it a useless precaution, but told him to do as he thought best, and went on to the consulate. He had not proceeded 200 steps, however, when by the greatest chance in the world he met Fix. The detective seemed wholly taken by surprise. What? Had Fogg and himself crossed the Pacific together and not met on the steamer? At least Fix felt honored to behold once more the gentleman to whom he owed so much, and as his business recalled him to Europe, he should be delighted to continue the journey in such pleasant company. Mr. Fogg replied the honor would be his, and the detective, who was determined not to lose sight of him, begged permission to accompany them in their walk about San Francisco, a request which Mr. Fogg readily granted. They soon found themselves in Montgomery Street, where a great crowd was collected. The sidewalks, street, horse-car rails, shop doors, windows of the houses, and even the roofs were full of people. Men were going about carrying large posters, and flags and streamers were floating in the wind, while loud cries were heard on every hand. "Hurrah for Camberfield! Hurrah for Mandaboy!" It was a political meeting, at least so Fix conjectured, who said to Mr. Fogg,
"Perhaps we better not mingle with the crowd. There might be danger in it."
"Yes, and blows. Even if they are political, are still blows." Fix smiled at this remark, and in order to be able to see without being jostled about, the party took up a position on the top of a flight of steps, situated at the upper end of Montgomery Street. Opposite them, on the other side of the street, between a coal wharf and a petroleum warehouse, a large platform had been erected in the open air, towards which the current of the crowd seemed to be directed. For what purpose was this meeting? What was the occasion of this excited assemblage? Phileas Fogg couldn't imagine. Was it to nominate some high official, a governor, or a member of Congress? Well, it wasn't improbable, so agitated was the multitude before them. Just at this moment there was an unusual stir in the human mass. All the hands were raised in the air. Some tightly closed seemed to disappear suddenly in the midst of the cries, in an energetic way, no doubt, of casting a vote. The crowd swayed back, the banners and flags wavered, disappeared an instant, and then reappeared in tatters. The undulations of this human surge reached the steps, while all the heads floundered in the surface like a sea agitated by a squall. But many of the black hats disappeared, and the greater part of the crowd seemed to have diminished in height.
"It's evidently a meeting, and its object must be an exciting one. I shouldn't wonder that if it were about the Alabama, despite the fact the question's settled."
"Oh, perhaps."
"At least there are two champions in the presence of each other, Mr. Camberfield and Mr. Mandaboy."
Auda, leaning upon Mr. Fogg's arm, observed the tumultuous scene with surprise, while Fix asked a man near him what the cause of all it was. Before the man could reply, a fresh agitation arose. Hurrahs and excited shouts were heard, the staffs of banners began to be used as offensive weapons, and fists flew in about every direction. Thumps were exchanged from the top of the carriages and omnibuses, which had been blocked up in the crowd. Boots and shoes went whirling through the air, and Mr. Fogg thought he even heard the crack of a revolver mingling in the din. The rout approached the stairway and flowed over the lower step. One of the parties had evidently been repulsed, but the mere lookers-on could not tell whether Mandaboy or Camberfield had gained the upper hand.
"It'd be prudent for us to retire," said Fix, who was anxious that Mr. Fogg should not receive any injury, at least till they got back to London. "If there's any question about England and all this, and we were recognized, I'd fear it'd go hard with us."
"An English subject." But Mr. Fogg was not able to finish his sentence, for a terrific hubbub now arose on the terrace, behind the flight of steps where they stood, and there were frantic shouts of "Hurrah for Mandaboy! Hip, hip, hurrah!" It was a band of voters coming to the rescue of their allies, and taking the Camberfield forces in flank. Mr. Fogg, Auda, and Fix found themselves between two fires, and it was too late to escape. The torrent of men, armed with loaded canes and sticks, was irresistible. Phileas Fogg and Fix were roughly hustled in their attempts to protect their fair companion, and the former, as cool as ever, tried to defend himself with the weapons which nature has placed at the end of every Englishman's arm, but in vain. A big, brawny fellow with a red beard, flushed face, and broad shoulders, who seemed to be the chief of the band, raised his clenched fist to strike Mr. Fogg, whom he would have given a crushing blow, had not Fix rushed in and received it in his stead. An enormous bruise immediately made its appearance under the detective's silk hat, which was completely smashed in.
Yankee?
Wait, no, this is Fogg. Yankee, exclaimed Mr. Fogg, darting a contemptuous look at the ruffian.
Englishman, we'll meet again.
When you please.
What's your name?
Phileas Fogg, and yours?
Colonel Stamp Proctor.
The human tide now swept by, after overturning Fix, who had speedily gotten up on his feet again, though with tattered clothes. Happily, he wasn't seriously hurt. His traveling overcoat was divided into 2 unequal parts, and his trousers resembled those of certain Indians, which fit less compactly than they're easy to put on. Ouda had escaped unharmed, and Fix alone bore marks of the fray in his black and blue bruise. Thanks, said Fogg to the detective as soon as they were out of the crowd.
No thanks necessary. Let's go.
Where?
To a tailor's.
Such a visit was indeed opportune. The clothing of Mr. Fogg and Fix were in rags, as if they themselves had been actively engaged in the contest between Cammerfield and Mandiboy. An hour later they were once more suitably attired, and without a return to the International Hotel. Passepartout was waiting for his master, armed with half a dozen 6-barreled revolvers. When he perceived Fix, he knit his brows, but Ouda, having in a few words told him of their adventure, his countenance resumed its placid expression. Fix was evidently no longer an enemy, but an ally. He was faithfully keeping his word. Dinner over, the coach which was to convey the passengers and their luggage to the station drew up to the door. As he was getting in, Mr. Fogg said to Fix, You've not seen this Colonel Proctor again.
No.
I will come back to America to find him, said Phileas calmly. It would not be right for an Englishman to permit himself to be treated in that way, without retaliating. The detective smiled, but he didn't reply. It was clear that Mr. Fogg was one of those Englishmen who, while they didn't tolerate dueling at home, fight abroad when their honour's attacked. At a corner before 6, the travellers entered the station, and found the train ready to depart. As he was about to enter it, Mr. Fogg called the porter and said to him, My friend, was there not some trouble today in San Francisco?
It was a political meeting, sir.
But I thought there was a great deal of disturbance in the streets.
It was only a meeting assembled for the election.
The election of a general-in-chief, no doubt.
No, sir. I addressed it to the peace.
And with this, Phileas Fogg got onto the train, which started off at full speed. Chapter 26, in which Phileas Fogg and party travel by the Pacific Railroad. From ocean to ocean, so say the Americans, and these 4 words compose the general designation of the great trunk line which crosses the entire width of the United States. The Pacific Railroad is, however, really divided into 2 distinct lines, the Central Pacific between San Francisco and Ogden, and the Union Pacific between Ogden and Omaha. 5 main lines connect Omaha with New York. New York and San Francisco are thus united by an uninterrupted metal ribbon, which measures no less than 3,786 miles. Between Omaha and the Pacific, the railway crosses a territory which is still infested by natives and wild beasts, and a large tract which the Mormons, after they were driven from Illinois in 1845, began to colonize. The journey from New York to San Francisco consumed, formerly, under the most favorable conditions, at least 6 months, but now it was able to be accomplished in as little as 7 days. It was in 1862 that, in spite of the southern members of Congress who wished a more southerly route, it was decided to lay the road between the 41st and 42nd parallels. President Lincoln himself fixed the end of the line at Omaha, in Nebraska. The work was at once commenced, and with true American energy, nor did the rapidity with which it went on injuriously affect its good execution. The road grew on the prairies 1.5 miles a day. A locomotive running on the rails laid down the evening before brought the rails to be laid on the morrow, and advanced upon them as fast as they were put in position. The Pacific Railroad is joined by several branches in Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, and Oregon. I'm in one of those states. On leaving Omaha, it passes along the left bank of the Pilat River as far as the junction of its northern branch, follows its southern branch, crosses the Laramie Territory and the Wasatch Mountains, turns the Great Salt Lake, and reaches Salt Lake City, the Mormon capital, plunges into the Tulia Valley, across the American Desert, Cedar and Humboldt Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, and descends via Sacramento to the Pacific. Its grade, even on the Rocky Mountains, never exceeding 112 feet to the mile. Such was the road to be traversed in 7 days, which would enable Phileas Fogg, well, at least he hoped, to take the Atlantic steamer at New York on the 11th for Liverpool. The car which he occupied was a sort of long omnibus on 8 wheels, and with no compartments in the interior. It was supplied with 2 rows of seats, perpendicular to the direction of the train, on either side of an aisle, which conducted to the front and rear platforms. These platforms were found throughout the train, and the passengers were able to pass from one end of the train to the other. It was supplied with saloon cars, balcony cars, restaurants, and smoking cars. Theater cars alone were wanting, and they still have these some day. Book and news dealers, sellers of edibles, drinkables, and cigars, who seemed to have plenty of customers, were continually circulating in the aisles. The train left Oakland Station at 6 o'clock, and it was already night, cold and cheerless, the heavens being overcast with clouds which seemed to threaten snow. The train didn't proceed rapidly. Counting the stoppages, it didn't run more than 20 miles an hour, which was a sufficient speed, however, to enable it to reach Omaha within its designated time. There was but little conversation in the car, and soon many of the passengers were overcome with sleep. Passepartout found himself beside the detective, but he didn't talk to him. After recent events, their relations with each other had grown somewhat cold. There could no longer be mutual sympathy or intimacy between them. Fix's manner had not changed, but Passepartout was very reserved and ready to strangle his former friend on the slightest provocation. Snow began to fall an hour after they started, a fine snow, however, which happily could not obstruct the train. Nothing could be seen from the windows but a vast white sheet, against which the smoke of the locomotive had a grayish aspect. At 8 o'clock, a steward entered the car and announced that the time for going to bed had arrived, and in a few minutes the car was transformed into a dormitory. The backs of the seats were thrown back, bedsteads carefully packed were rolled out by an ingenious system, berths were suddenly improvised, and each traveler soon had at his disposition a comfortable bed, protected from curious eyes by thick curtains. The sheets were clean and the pillows soft. It only remained to go to bed and sleep, which everybody did, while the train sped on across the state of California. The country between San Francisco and Sacramento isn't very hilly. The Central Pacific, taking Sacramento for its starting point, extends eastward to meet the road from Omaha. The line from San Francisco to Sacramento runs in a northeasterly direction along the American River, which empties into the San Pablo Bay. The 120 miles between these cities were accomplished in 6 hours, and toward midnight, while fast asleep, the travelers passed through Sacramento, so that they saw nothing of that important place, the seat of the state government with its fine quays, broad streets, noble hotels, squares, and churches. The train, on leaving Sacramento and passing the junction, Rosslyn, Auburn, and Colfax, entered the range of the Sierra Nevada. Cisco was reached at 7 in the morning, and an hour later the dormitory was transformed into an ordinary car, and the travelers could observe the picturesque beauties of the mountain regions through which they were steaming. The railway track wound in and out among the passes, now approaching the mountain sides, now suspended over precipices, avoiding abrupt angles by bold curves, plunging into narrow defiles which seemed to have no outlet. The locomotive, its great funnel emitting a weird light with its sharp bell and its cowcatcher extended like a spur, mingled its shrieks and bellowings with the noise of torrents and cascades, and twined its smoke among the branches of the gigantic pines. There were few or no bridges or tunnels on the route. The railway turned around the sides of the mountains and didn't attempt to violate nature by taking the shortest cut from one point to another. The train entered the state of Nevada through the Carson Valley about 9 o'clock, always going northeasterly, and at midday reached Reno, where there was a delay of 20 minutes for breakfast. From this point the road, running along the Humboldt River, passed northward for several miles by its banks. Then it turned eastward and kept by the river until it reached the Humboldt Range, nearly at the extreme eastern limit of Nevada. Having breakfasted, Mr. Fogg and his companions resumed their places in the car, and observed the varied landscape which unfolded itself as they passed along the vast prairies, the mountains lining the horizon, and the creeks with their frosty, foaming streams. Sometimes a great herd of buffalo, massing together in the distance, seemed like a movable dam. These innumerable multitudes of ruminating beasts often form an insurmountable obstacle to the passage of the trains. Thousands of them have been seen passing over the track for hours together in compact ranks. The locomotive is then forced to stop and wait until the road is once more clear. This happened, indeed, to the train in which Mr. Fogg was traveling. About 12 o'clock, a troop of 10 or 12,000 head of buffalo encumbered the track. The locomotive, slackening its speed, tried to clear the way with its cow-catchers, but the mass of animals was too great. The buffaloes marched along with a tranquil gait, uttering now and then deafening bellowings. There was no use of interrupting them, for having taken a particular direction, nothing can moderate and change their course. It's a torrent of living flesh which no dam could contain. The travelers gazed on this curious spectacle from the platforms, but Phileas Fogg, who had the most reason of all to be in a hurry, remained in his seat and waited philosophically until it should please the buffaloes to get out of the way. Passepartout was furious at the delay they occasioned, and longed to discharge his arsenal of revolvers upon them.
"What the country, mere cattle stop the trains, and go by in a procession just as if they were not impeding travel. Parbleu, I should like to know if Mr. Fogg foresaw this mishap in his programme, and he is an engineer who doesn't dare to run the locomotive in this herd of beasts."
The engineer didn't try to overcome the obstacle, and he was wise. He'd have crushed the first buffaloes, no doubt, with a cow-catcher, but the locomotive, however powerful, would have soon been checked. The train would have inevitably been thrown off the track, and would then have been helpless. The best course was to wait patiently, and regain the lost time by greater speed when the obstacle was removed. The procession of buffaloes lasted 3 full hours, and it was night before the track was clear. The last ranks of the herd were now passing over the rails, while the first had already disappeared below the southern horizon. It was 8 o'clock when the train passed through the defiles of the Humboldt Range, and 9:30 when it penetrated Utah, the region of the Great Salt Lake, the singular colony of the Mormons. All right, folks. So we're going to leave it there. Next week, come back for chapter 27. How many? I think we have almost only 10 chapters left if you count the one we're on. So that's, something to look forward to. We may actually finish this next week. And if not, there's always the week after that. We'll see. We'll cross that bridge when we get there. Anyway, folks, I gotta promote my stuff while I'm here. If you're listening to this as a recording, you should be well aware that this video goes up on Thursday. The week following the actual recording that's live on Twitch, the previous week's Friday. So that's something to keep in mind if you want to tune into this live. I have a YouTube original piece of content every Monday. That's usually my first impression series for some Tundra finds, and it's a good time if you like gaming. As an extension of my Twitch, where this is recorded, I also do a variety game stream on Wednesday nights, if that's more your style. And the VOD for those go up on Saturday. The VODs are currently a long ways behind, and I do that by design, don't worry. But anyway, that's my spiel. That's everything that I do on the internet now. And anyway, this has been Paper Cuts. I hope it didn't sting.